It did show a certain ugliness to the war.
Yeah, so that's something too. And something else you mentioned is a movie like this isn't as much of a bygone era as we think. Because you could argue pro-military movies are still being made today about contemporary events like Black Hawk Down. There was one, Benghazi.
Oh yeah, 13 hours.
Yeah.
I mean, if you watch the movie like 13 hours, it's a little, obviously the special effects and the acting is a little slicker, but it's essentially the same movie. It's these superheroes, fighting off gazillions of people attacking their base. I mean, it's a different setting, but it's essentially the same movie.
And I forgot about this, but Michael Bay's Pearl Harbor, which, we can get into how bad it is historically, but just as a film, the thing I mentioned about John Wayne speaking to the middle distance, Alec Baldwin is a commander who's helping lead the Doolittle raid, and he'll say things like, "History will look back on this time when there was nothing stronger than the heart of the American volunteer." And I think, who are you speaking to, Alec Baldwin? You're not talking to anyone when you say that.
It also this was one of the first movies, it was one of the few Vietnam movies that received a lot of support from the Pentagon. So they were showing the correct equipment that was used in Vietnam, and some of the strategies and the tactics that the Green Beret would use in combat. A lot more so than, there was a reaction to movies like this in the 70s and the 80s with Vietnam movies like the Born on the 4th of July and what was Apocalypse Now, obviously, Platoon, these movies that were very anti-Vietnam War and painted almost as much of a caricature in the other direction that this movie did in the opposite direction. You really have to get into movies like, it wasn't very common. It was kind of popular at the time that it came out, but it didn't have the staying power. There was a great movie called The Siege of Firebase Gloria that showed the really gruesomeness of the Vietnam War, but it didn't have the really overtone of something like Platoon that was just, obviously I wasn't in Vietnam, but I think that, there's something in between a lot of these movies that it wasn't as, completely pristine and clean as what the Green Beret was showing, but it wasn't also on the other side of the spectrum either.
Yeah, I think that this movie, it might fall into the trap of any movie that is trying to make a thesis statement about an entire war, whether it's good or whether it's bad. There was one that came out a few years ago with Matt Damon called Green Zone that it's kind of hard to follow because it's trying to explain de-Baathification and the problems in the beginning of the Iraq War that led to the insurgency and all these other things. But it wasn't so much a story as a thesis statement on the war itself. And a problem that I run into in contemporary history is there's so much interest in World War II. I mean, for good reason, because it completely altered the global world order in the 20th century, and we're still feeling its after effects today. But honestly, I'm getting sick of questions about World War II on my podcast. I take questions from listeners. So if you have any listeners out here, pro tip, if you want me to answer your question, don't ask me something about World War II because I'm probably not going to answer it because I'm honestly I'm sick of World War II. But this idea, and it was so black and white of you're going against Hitler, man. I mean, it's not more black and white than that. But a lot of warfare simply doesn't work that way throughout human history. It's much more muddled. There's much more shades of gray. So to make a thesis statement on it's unequivocally good or unequivocally bad, then your characters stop really becoming characters embedded in a real human drama and they become archetypes. So, and archetypes work in something like Lord of the Rings, but in a real human movie where then it gets silly. So two movies that I think do a good job of getting into the human element. And I'll probably follow up more on this in the end when we talk about how to make this particular movie better. Clint Eastwood released 2 movies back to back in 2006. Great director, Clint Eastwood. Just saw The Mule recently. Man, guy's still kicking at 89. Don't know how he does it. But Letters from Iwo Jima and Flags of Our Fathers both focus on Iwo Jima. One is from the Japanese perspective and one is on the American perspective. And Clint is not going over the top, showing how just like this sepia tone nostalgia of World War II, that there are some real shocks and horrors of war, but he gets down into the human element where, yes, you believe in the bigger cause, but a lot of times you're just fighting for your brother in arms on the other side of you. So really digging into the human element of the war and not trying to make a thesis statement on the totality of the war itself. So I think those are 2 movies that I think do a good job of this.
Yeah, I think that's, and hopefully as Vietnam becomes more of history and it's not as much current events, we'll see more movies that are reevaluations of the conflict.
Yeah. One book author I talked to wrote a book called Saving Bravo about a rescue mission in Vietnam for an intelligence officer. And this is in the early 70s when the war is winding down. People know it's going to end soon. And many people are dispirited to even fight because they've heard about the troop casualty numbers. They don't really know why they're there. People are dispirited. So it's not this type of heroic triumphalism like American troops in World War II marching to Berlin and marching through the streets of Paris after they liberate it. It's when I talked to this author, he said, many people who were on this rescue mission, they really felt for the first time like they were involved in something wonderful. And even though they had become disillusioned with the larger aims of the war, they were fighting for the brother on the other side of them. And that's something that felt like it gave them cause to go after. So there you find these smaller stories of heroism and bravery and other things that you can find in other wars, but it's maybe not the overarching narrative isn't the same way too. So and what I like about stories of the Vietnam War is, from what I know of other wars throughout human history, the Vietnam War looks much more similar to other wars in history than World War II does. I mean, if you were in the 30 Years' War and you were conscripted as an Austrian youth, you probably really didn't know why you're fighting. Wait, so I'm Protestant, they're Catholic, and I'm shooting them. Why? Because of this theology I don't get? What's going on here?
Yeah.
So I feel more like Vietnam can give us kind of a better entryway into much of history than World War II is. It's an anomaly for so many reasons that I think it can distort how we look at a lot of things.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
Now, for me to make this movie even better, I mean, obviously you have to have more John Wayne. You got to have more Ballad of the Green Beret.
But does that movie play much during the actual movie, or is it just over the credits?
I believe I think it's just at the end credits. The movie could have been toned down a bit. It really was. It was over the top, but I think that it gave a really good representation of the special forces and how the special forces saw themselves and their ethos, training, equipment. I also think that it really gave the Vietnamese, both the South Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese, a fair shake. It wasn't painting them as just the enemy and as evil. In a lot of the movies, the South Vietnamese army was run down. You know, they showed them as professionals. I think that the movie was just not as bad as what the critics portrayed it as. And I think that it gives you a sense of something that was going on at that time. And I think that's what the best thing you can get from a historical movie is that it tapped into something that was realistic at the time that the movie was made.
Yeah, I think that realism is good, and they do incorporate South Vietnamese in there. I think more incorporation could have been better, because the aims of the early part of the Vietnam War, which is when this takes place, is to equip and support South Vietnam so that they can successfully beat back the Soviet incursion and keep up the Cold War policy of containment. So more of that element, I think, would have been good. I don't know if it would have been possible in the 60s with John Wayne at the helm, where just be happy that you got George Takei, even though he's not Vietnamese. But hey, it's Mr. Sulu. He was sort of your go-to Hollywood actor of Asian background at that time period. So I guess take what you get.
Yeah, it is. It really is a time capsule that you can, you even see like behind the scenes where, how Asian actors were treated, and just that the timing of the movie, that it was sort of tone deaf to what was going on in the culture. But I think that's interesting to see.
Yeah, exactly. So, and it shows that there wasn't a monolith of Vietnam protesters at this time. And I did a web series on Audie Murphy, the World War II hero who killed hundreds of Germans in World War II. But he was also a Hollywood actor after he came back to America, and was an actor active from the late 40s to the 70s. And his career spans this very time, where for a long time he's in Westerns and just does all these Western B movies. And then once you get to the mid and late 60s, he feels like Hollywood has passed him by, where it's cool to be focused on edgy outlaws, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Bonnie and Clyde, all this stuff. And he would do sort of these old-fashioned Westerns, but he was Audie Murphy did films for the U.S. Army supporting the war effort, and he was a little bit baffled of what happened. Hollywood had full support of the war effort in World War II, and now everyone's turning against it. But then there's a few holdouts like John Wayne or Audie Murphy or others who are kind of part of the old guard, but not part of the new guard. So people weren't a monolith back then, just like they're not a monolith now.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of things to look at in this movie than just the surface of it. It really does. It gets into all these different threads that were going on at the time, which is kind of interesting. I think that probably comes a lot that the movie was made during the war, which a lot of the movies that John Wayne did make were happening during the conflict that they covered, like the Flying Tigers. And I think he made one where he was a Marine, where he's often just so wrongly casted too. Like you said with the Conqueror, I mean, he's cast as Genghis Khan, but he's also in this movie, he's way too old to be in the special forces.
He's got to be, what, his 50s or 60s when this is filmed?
He might even be in his 70s at that point. He was very old, and even like in some of the movies he played during the World War II times, where he was maybe in his 40s, he's playing a guy like in his 20s.
Yeah, where scenes where he's moving around and you think, I'm not sure he can raise his arms above his head or bend at his waist. So as long as he remains stationary, it's fine. But wow. All right. Well, any other thoughts on this, Steve, for good or for ill?
No, but I think if there's other movies that people out there, they love or they hate, I'm sure that one of us will either love it or hate it. So we can definitely talk about those movies too.
Yeah, absolutely. Send your suggestions in. And stay tuned for the next episode as we continue going through movies that are either historically good or historically terrible, and why we can both love them or hate them for exactly those reasons. All right, that is today's episode. As always, I want to thank the Knowlton's Rangers, especially our Spy Masters, Bill Ivey, Joyce Normant, Tyler from Colorado, Josh Reddick, Baron Fraser, Chris from Maine, Carl from Norway, Moondoggy from Ohio, Rick Knowlton, Vic and Irene, Mike from New York, Michelle, and Marlene. I'll explain what that is in a second. If you like the show and want to help it grow, there are 4 easy ways for you to do it. 1, like and subscribe to the show on the podcast player of your choice. This helps spread the word about the show. 2, join our Facebook group. Here we can keep the discussion going about new episodes, and you can talk about what you like and didn't like. And you can find this group if you just search for History Unplugged on Facebook. 3, we have an online store with t-shirts, phone covers, and other accessories featuring awesomely bad history puns that were crowdsourced by you, the audience. And you can find that if you go to tpublic, public.com and look for History Unplugged, or you just go to historyonthenet.com and look for our store there. 4, and this is really the best way to dive deep with History Unplugged, and that's to become one of the Knowlton's Rangers. If you know your American history, you know the Knowlton's Rangers were an elite spy and reconnaissance group in the American Revolutionary War, but it's also the name of the membership program of History Unplugged. You can join at 3 levels. If you join at the level of Scout, you can hear all the episodes of History Unplugged